Hello, can everyone hear me? Maria, will you just let me know in the chat? Yes, okay, sorry, I'm not used to StreamYard. So hello, my name is Melissa Sanchez. I'm the director of the Center for Research in Feminist, Queer, and Transgender Studies, as well as the program in Gender, Sexuality, and Women's Studies here at Penn. And thank you for coming today. I'm delighted to introduce the last of our series of events on that mark the 40th anniversary of two landmark publications for BIPOC queer feminist thought. This Bridge Called My Back, which was published in 1981, and But Some of Us Are Brave, which was published in 1982. This series of conversations on these two volumes is part of a year of programming on care for the future. And these volumes' insights on the mutual formation of gender, sexuality, race, class, ability, environment, slavery, and colonialism are testaments to the centrality of care in foundational queer feminist writing. Our speakers over the year have been asked to consider the influence of these volumes to their own work on racialized gender and sexuality. Today's conversation between Jennifer Nash and Jasbir Puar, moderated by my colleague David Eng, is the final event in this series. Before we begin, and in an effort to recognize both historical practices and ongoing legacies of settler colonialism, I want to acknowledge that the University of Pennsylvania stands on the Lenapehoking Indigenous Territory. This is the traditional homeland of the Lenape, Lenape, or Delaware Indians, whose descendants include the Delaware Tribe and Delaware Nation of Oklahoma, the Nanticoke Lenape, Ramapo Lenape, and Powhatan Lenape of New Jersey, and the Munsee Delaware of Ontario. This year at the center, our focus has been, as I mentioned, on care work, which we see as inseparable from an ongoing effort to recognize and redress individual and institutional roles in settler colonialism, including the histories and legacies of violence and displacement, and to surface Indigenous knowledges, care practices, and relations with and within the environment and the land. To this end, we here at the center are working with Penn for Pilots, the staff and faculty group that is advocating for Penn, the largest private property owner in Philadelphia, to participate in payments in lieu of taxes program. We also encourage everyone present at this event today to check out the resources available through Natives at Penn, and to consider signing the petition for Penn to recognize Indigenous Peoples Day. I will drop links to both into the chat a little bit later. Before I hand things over to my colleague David Eng who will introduce our speakers, I want first to introduce him. Doing this briefly is not an easy task, since David's extraordinary productivity and influence as a scholar, teacher, and mentor does not lend itself easily to brevity. Just to touch on the highlights, David L. Eng is Richard L. Fisher Professor of English here at the University of Pennsylvania. He is also affiliated with the program in Asian American Studies, Comparative Literature and Literary Theory, and the program in Gender, Sexuality, and Women's Studies. He has held visiting professorships at the University of Bergen in Norway, King's College London, Harvard, and the University of Hong Kong. He is the recipient of numerous fellowships and awards, most recently the Kessler Prize from the Center for LGBTQ Studies, or CLAGS, a prize which is given to a scholar and/or activist who has produced a body of work that has had significant influence on the field of LGBTQ studies. Eng's many awards recognize the importance that his work has had to scholars and students across queer, Asian American, psychoanalytic, American, and law and literature studies. Eng is the author of 3 books: Racial Melancholia, Racial Dissociation on the Social and Psychic Lives of Asian Americans, which was co-authored with Shin Hee Han and published by Duke in 2019, and the winner of the Boyer Book Prize and the Association for Asian American Studies Book Award Honorable Mention. His second book, The Feeling of Kinship, Queer Liberalism and the Racialization of Intimacy, was published by Duke in 2010. And his first book, Racial Castration, Managing Masculinity in Asian America, was published by Duke in 2001. David is also co-editor with David Kazanjian of Loss, The Politics of Mourning, and with Alice Home of Q&A, Queer in Asian America, winner of a Lambda Literary Award and Association of Asian American Studies Book Award. He has also co-edited 3 special issues of the journal Social Text, Left of Queer with Jasbir Puar, China and the Human with Temu Ruscola and Shuang Shen, and What's Queer About Queer Studies Now with Jack Halberstam and Jose Esteban Munoz. His current book project, Reparations and the Human, investigates the relationship between political and psychic genealogies of reparation in Cold War Asia and the Americas. Again, in the interest of brevity, I will not list all that David does at Penn, but I will say that he is a leader in every department he is affiliated with, habitually going above and beyond any expectations for engagement. I'm a personal beneficiary of his generosity, and I've learned so much from his example and his mentorship. I can think of no one I'd be more delighted to introduce, and no one who better exemplifies the care that truly keeps our intellectual, political, and personal lives going. Take it away, David.
Thank you, Melissa. It's great to see everybody today. Thank you for joining us in this final discussion commemorating the 40th anniversary of these 2 landmark publications, Cherie Moraga and Gloria Anzandula's This Bridge Called My Back, writings by radical women of color, and Gloria T. Hull, Patricia Bell Scott, and Barbara Smith's All the Women Are White, All the Blacks Are Men, but Some of Us Are Brave, Black Women's Studies. So the format of the discussion for today is this. We have until 1:30 to talk and chat with each other and to hear from Jen and Jasbir. So we will start with short reflections, first from Jen and then Jasbir, 10 to 15 minutes apiece. And then I will host a discussion between Jen and Jasbir for about 30 minutes. And we will use the remaining time for questions from YouTube, from you guys, that will be moderated by me. So let me do the introductions first, and then we will go right into it. Jennifer C. Nash is the Jean Fox O'Barr Professor of Gender, Sexuality, and Feminist Studies at Duke University. She earned her PhD in African American Studies at Harvard University and her JD at Harvard Law School. She is the author of 3 books: The Black Body in Ecstasy, Reading Race, Reading Pornography, which was published in 2014 and received the Alan Bray Memorial Book Prize by the GLQ Caucus of the Modern Language Association. Her second book is entitled Black Feminism Reimagined. That was published in 2018 and was awarded the Gloria Anzaldúa Book Prize, yay, by the National Women's Studies Association. And most recently, her third monograph is Birthing Black Mothers, which was just published last year in 2021. And Jen was just telling us that she also moved in the middle of the pandemic. So you have been extremely, extremely productive. All I did was sit around and watch Netflix. Her research has been supported by the ACLS Burkhart Fellowship, the Radcliffe Institute at Harvard, and the Woodrow Wilson Junior Faculty Career Enhancement Fellowship. Jen's current book project is How We Write Now, Living with Black Feminist Theory. Our second speaker today is Jasbir Puar, who is professor of women's gender and sexuality studies at Rutgers University. She is the author of 2 award-winning books, The Right to Maim, Debility, Capacity, Disability, which was published in 2017, as well as Terrorist Assemblages, Homo-Nationalism in Queer Times, which was published in 2007. Terrorist Assemblages was reissued as an expanded version for its 10th anniversary in 2017, and it's been translated into Spanish and French and is forthcoming in Greek and Portuguese. Jasbir's scholarly and mainstream writings have been translated into more than 15 languages, and she is also co-author of exhibitions for the Sharjah Architectural Triennial, which occurred in 2019, and the Sharjah Art Biennial, which is upcoming in 2023. Jasbir is the recipient of the 2019 Kessler Award from the Center for Lesbian and Gay Studies, CLAGS, at CUNY, which recognizes lifetime achievement in the impact on queer research and organizing. So I wanted to welcome both Jen and Jasbir virtually to Penn. I wanted to thank you for all your time and effort today. I want to thank Maria and Melissa for all the organizing, and let's just jump right into it. So Jen is going to begin first.
Hi, everybody. Hopefully you can hear me. David, can you hear me? Okay, awesome. I want to thank Maria and Melissa both for the invitation, David for generously moderating and also for really generous introductions. And I wanted to thank Jasbir, with whom I've been thinking on the page for probably a decade now. It's really great to be in a space with you. So my comments for today center on Gloria T. Hull, Patricia Bell-Scott, and Barbara Smith's co-edited anthology, All the Women Are White, All the Blacks Are Men, But Some of Us Are Brave, published in 1982 on the Feminist Press. But before I dive into talking about Some of Us Are Brave, it is crucial to me to note what might seem obvious, that both Some of Us Are Brave and This Bridge Called My Back, the texts at the heart of today's celebration, are anthologies. And as Samantha Pinto and I note in our forthcoming piece in Feminist Studies, which is also a celebration of Bridge and Some of Us Are Brave, the anthology has been a key vehicle for producing women of color as a legible and coherent category, a fact that remains an under-theorized aspect of the ongoing travels of both canonical texts. We might think about other anthologies that have been central to the production of women of color feminist thought, like Homegirls, or Between Women and Nation, or Scattered Hegemonies, or Feminist Genealogies, Colonial Legacies, and Democratic Futures, all of which brought Black feminism, women of color feminism, and transnational feminism to the US women's studies classroom. So even as both of the anthologies that are the subject of today's celebration refuse the notion of women of color as a coherent category, these anthologies have puzzlingly traveled as literal commodities, standing in for difference rather than interrogating it. The circulation of these books as women of color texts is particular to the current moment, this current moment, in the genesis of our field's ongoing institutionalization, retaining defensive postures, even while disappearing the work that has come between then, as exemplified by these 2 anthologies, and now, a critical moment where Blackness is coming to stand in for all difference. Pinto and I flag these texts as anthologies to ask how we might teach them or pieces from them as part of an anthological tradition, rather than as singular texts that stand in for women of color. In the opening pages of Bridge, Cherry Moraga notes, quote, "Such an anthology is in high demand these days, a book by radical women of color. The left needs it, with its shaky and shabby record of commitment to women, period." As we teach any of these anthologies, how might we help ourselves and our students understand this demand for a book by radical women of color that takes the form of a collection? Do we select the pieces written by those who have since become famous through their solo acts in academia or the arts, reproducing the star system model of the academy? Or do we teach these texts by looking for recurrences, for ways that things haven't changed at all in our feelings or reads or even experiences of racism? How might the way we use and teach these anthologies sometimes freeze time, erase it, or ask us not to closely examine the historical context of their production, or even the evidence of experience, to follow Joan Scott's famous essay? But my task for today is to think with all the women are white, all the Blacks are men, but some of us are brave. In the 40 years since this anthology was published, the book's title, or at least a portion of it, Some of Us Are Brave, has become something of a feminist slogan. Some of Us Are Brave is a refrain that signals the ongoing equivalences, real or imagined, of white and feminism, of Black and men. It signals how Black women's experiences and political longings get rendered invisible. And it is also a refrain that signals Black women's heroism, persistence, and courage in the face of this invisibility, in equivalence of Black women with moral certitude that I have elsewhere sought to challenge, even as it is a representation that can be so deeply seductive. We live in the era of the US left's celebration of Black women as icons of radical politics and as the saviors of democracy. We can think of the slogan, "Vote like a Black woman," even as it continues to be a long moment, an enduring moment of Black women's pathologization, demonization, and marginalization. But Some of Us Are Brave, as a slogan championing Black women's acts of courage, often obscures the bravery that particular volume hailed, the bravery of working within the university to forge something its editors called Black Women's Studies. Rather than treating the text as merely re-articulating Black women's bravery in the face of marginalization, I want to suggest that we treat it as an artifact in Black feminism's long, complicated, and ambivalent relationship with institutions, particularly the university. I ask, how might Some of Us Are Brave help us re-narrate the moment we now inhabit, or following Claire Hemmings's lead, allow us to tell different stories about the present? Indeed, we inhabit a scholarly and popular moment where Black feminist theorists so often celebrate undisciplined knowledge, which is Christina Sharp's term, or anti-disciplinary thinking, and champion forms of abolition that include the call to reimagine and often wholly reject the contemporary university. There is a way that Black radical thought generally and Black feminist thought specifically is described and imagined as an anti-institutional practice, as one that seeks to elude the capture of the institution, to dismantle the systems that ensnare us, that surveil and correct, and also that for many of us pay our bills. As Matt Brim reminds us in his book, Poor Queer Studies, quote, "We both are and are not our institutions, and we must inhabit that complexity and simultaneity." Yet the narrative of so much contemporary Black feminist work, or at least the performance of it, is that the institution pays me, but I am not of it. I have no desires around it, and I seek to be free of it. But Some of Us Are Brave works from the premise that institutions, particularly the university, are crucial to helping Black women get free, in the words of Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor's title, How We Get Free. Some of Us Are Brave is a book that believes in the university as a place where Black women can thrive. In fact, the book makes the case that Black women's studies as a disciplinary formation, as a site of knowledge production, is crucial to Black women's survival. To say it again, it begins from the proposition that the institutional formation of a disciplinary space is what will produce something like life and living for Black women, precisely because the editors tell us Black women's studies is a site rife with, in their words, political significance. Some of Us Are Brave's Black women's studies is neither women's studies nor Black studies, though it draws on and also departs from the central questions and preoccupations of both. Here we might ask how Black women's studies is different from the place of Black feminist theory now, which straddles Black studies and gender studies, which performs different kinds of theoretical and political work for both, and which is gestured to by each discipline to exculpate these respective fields from varying and different histories of exclusion and violence. The fact of Black women's studies, the editors insist, the fact of willing it into existence with imaginative, intellectual, and physical labor is an insistence on the fact that, quote, Black women exist and exist positively. Some of Us Are Brave is organized as a teaching guide. It offers a blueprint to department building, syllabus writing, and class organization. It provides lengthy bibliographies and course descriptions, which it calls, and I was so surprised to see this term there, doing the work. It urges Black women's studies departments to offer courses on sexual violence, on incarceration, on the history of Black women's domestic work, on Black women's mental health, and to center Black women's sexuality, with the note that, quote, for a Black woman to teach a course on Black lesbians would probably, in most universities, spell career suicide, not to mention the personal and emotional repercussions she would inevitably face. It is a guidebook for anyone who has ever served as a department administrator, who has thought about how to mount a curriculum in an interdisciplinary field, or has had to design a syllabus in Black feminist thought. Hall and Smith note their desires for, quote, our own places, conferences, institutes, journals, and institutions where we can be the Black women we are and gain respect for the amazing depth of perception that our identity brings. To do the work involved in creating Black women's studies, they continue, requires not only intellectual intensity, but the deepest courage. Some of Us Are Brave, then, is about forging space, institutional and intellectual, for Black feminist thought, not outside of the structure that oppresses, but within it. And it does this because it believes, as the co-editors note, that Black women's studies, quote, must consider as primary the knowledge that will save Black women's lives. In other words, Black women's studies as a discipline is a form of producing, archiving, and circulating knowledge that gives Black women what Joshua Chambers Letson would call many years later, more life. What does it mean to dream Black women's studies as a discipline and to insist that Black women, in their words, begin to name ourselves in the space of the university? I pose these questions because Some of Us Are Brave offers a vision of freedom that may surprise us 40 years later. The belief that an institutional space for Black women's studies might be what freedom looks like. In the years before Anne Ducille brilliantly diagnosed the occult of true Black womanhood, before Barbara Christian asked if Black feminism could survive the academy, and before Grace Hong told us to bring out our dead, to name the Black feminists of Barbara Christian's generation, June Jordan, Audre Lorde, Claudia Tate, Christian herself, and we might add Bell Hooks, Cheryl Wall, and Stephanie Camp, all of whom we have lost too soon. In these years, the editors of Some of Us Are Brave saw the university not as a death sentence, but as a life world for Black women. I want to register how utterly surprising it is to remember this about the anthology, to remember its steadfast commitment to the university. I flag this not to suggest that the editors and the authors included in the anthology were unaware of the risks, psychic, political, spiritual, and embodied, to doing the work of Black feminism in the university. Indeed, in the book's introduction, they note that, quote, to teach Black women's studies from a principled Black feminist perspective might endanger many Black women scholars' situations in their schools and departments. They knew these risks and determined that they were risks worth taking because of what departments, curricula, syllabi, courses, journals, and degrees could make possible. So how do we think with rather than against this legacy, one that can seem antithetical to a moment where the university is often diagnosed as a preeminent site of anti-Black misogynistic violence, where Black feminism is so often seen to have been weakened in or by the university, where Black feminist theory is simultaneously commodified and disposed of, where Black women and Black feminist thought still stand again and again only for difference in the diversity engine of the university. What Some of Us Are Brave offers us is an opportunity to reconsider one of the primary stories we tell about Black feminism, that it is an anti-institutional formation, always in frictional relationships with spaces like the university. This is a story where Black feminism is a form of fugitive or insurgent knowledge, where it remains always skeptical of the spaces that try to house or capture it, where it is anti-juridical, anti-state, anti-captivity, anti-normativity, anti-hierarchy, anti-domination, and anti-university. But Some of Us Are Brave requires that we reckon with how Black feminism has fought and still fights for institutional legitimacy and viability, for visibility and resources, and dare I say it, for power, which I argue it has earned and now likes to disavow. Brave reminds us that in a certain moment, Black women's courage was articulated not by their willingness to distance themselves from the institution, but by a willingness to be in it. For some, this is a tragic account. And in fact, I'm very interested in how much feminism loves these kinds of tragic tales now. So we regularly label practices, traditions, and methods forms of feminism that we disavow, like carceral feminism or neoliberal feminism or governance feminism or white feminism, all modes of feminist practice that we are supposed to condemn. Inherent to this condemnation, or part of this condemnation, is the idea that the will to power within feminism is pathological and antithetical to the project itself. That feminism all too often finds itself in bed with political projects it should disavow. And when it finds itself in that position, we know we have strayed from our imagined core principles. We've let feminism move in a way that is not what it should be. But some of us are brave suggest that Black feminism as we know it now desired institutional recognition, labored for it, and saw the university as a crucial battlefield in the fight for freedom, for what Patricia Williams calls the project of owning the self in a disowned world. Some of us are brave as an invitation to think about what was desired, a department of one's own, and what was won, perhaps not departments of our own, but gender studies departments that now regularly celebrate, at least rhetorically, their commitments to intersectional theorizing, women of color feminist methods and approaches to the study of gender and sexuality, journals like Meridians, conferences like NWSA that have been remade by the interventions of Black feminism and the labor of Black women. Some of us are brave requires that we chart new genealogies of Black feminism that think with, rather than against, Black feminism's longstanding attachment to the university, and investment not in dismantling it, but in fortifying it. This is not a sign of the tradition's pathology, I don't think. It's a sign of its complexity. And your reaction to it, if it's anything like mine, might feel something like ambivalence. From where I sit, academic Black feminism is many things, from a set of commitments to a paycheck, from a generative and world-making body of questions to a profession. And the place I find myself in now, the place that some of us are brave helps me understand, is that this ambivalence toward institutionality and power cannot and should not be resolved or disavowed. It's a sign of the rich and generative tensions at the heart of Black feminist practice. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Can everyone hear me? I'm going to assume yes. Okay, thank you. Hello, everyone. I'm really pleased to be here in conversation with Jennifer, who I also have been thinking with for a very long time, and also my dear friend and colleague, David. And I also want to thank Melissa Sanchez and Maria Murphy and the Center for Research in Transgender, Queer, and Feminist Studies at the University of Pennsylvania for bringing us together today. I've really enjoyed thinking about these two foundational anthologies. I was kind of wowed by this opportunity in part because I have really vivid memories of my first encounters with Some of Us Are Brave and also This Bridge, which happened at deeply needed moments. I was doing a master's degree in women's studies in 1992 at the University of York in England. So it's been 30 years for me. It's a little bit daunting to register how long ago that was. At the time, I was completely new to feminist literature, feminist theory. I just started reading Bell Hooks, Angela Davis. I was also in an all-white or nearly all-white cohort in the second oldest women's studies graduate program in the UK. You know, I was confused and alienated. These would be understatements, really. But I have a very kind of, to set the scene, a very unrelenting visual of a cold, sterile York University library where I was sitting there with that green cover of Some of Us Are Brave, and this incredible photo on the cover of two young Black women, quote, probably somewhere in Virginia, circa 1901. And, you know, being so happy that I found this book. In this very same library, I also discovered This Bridge, and also, you know, Jennifer had already mentioned Homegirls, which was edited by Barbara Smith in 1982, Making Face, Making Soul, Hacienda Caros, which was edited by Gloria Anzaldúa. I also can't forget, and there's so many other anthologies that we could mention, and of course there's also, you know, so many queer and queer of color anthologies that started emerging in the 90s. But I can't also cannot forget Making Waves, writing by and about Asian Asian American women, which was published by Asian Women United of California. So these are some of the books that really saved me at this time. And with Some of Us Are Brave in particular, and this speaks to what Jennifer was just talking about, it was so helpful to think about this kind of radical intervention of Black women's studies and what that could be like in that current context I was in of being in a white women's studies program. So my comments today are really focused around teaching these anthologies and how teaching these anthologies are different than teaching single pieces or numerous pieces from these anthologies. In anticipation of this conversation, I did teach both of these anthologies last fall in my advanced undergraduate course on feminist knowledge production. This is a course for majors and minors. And I was surprised, though in retrospect, I should not have been, that students, for the most part, did not know of or had not even heard of these actual anthologies and had not known their significance, even though they had read many of the more prominent pieces in them. And those pieces, if you're not familiar, A Black Feminist Statement by the Combahee River Collective is in both of them. Audre Lorde's classic, The Master's Tools Will Not Dismantle the Master's House, as well as another classic, An Open Letter to Mary Daly. Then there's Across the Kitchen Table, a sister and to sister dialogue between Barbara Smith and Beverly Smith. Lesbian as an Act of Resistance by Cheryl Clark. La Guerra by Cherie Moraga, Barbara Smith's Towards a Black Feminist Criticism. So I, like many others, I suspect, have been teaching these pieces, kind of excerpted from these anthologies. And so I started thinking about what is gained and what is lost by such practices. And again, I really appreciate what Jennifer was saying about anthologies being this kind of key vehicle of producing a kind of legible forms of theorizing from women of color. There's so many different elements of these anthologies that give individual pieces life, right? The syllabi, how neat was it, or is it to see June Jordan's syllabus from the 70s? Both have bibliographies, first-person narration, poetry, letters to each other, phenomenal prefaces. There's also an art folio and bridge. And through these polyvocal materials, students really appreciated having a greater sense of relational context, having a more solidified understanding of who's in struggle together and who's thinking through what kinds of labor is involved in putting together a project that has so many cross conversations going on. So I think my sense was that they encountered by and large for the first time the kind of richness of a collective voice that had otherwise not necessarily been known to them around some of their most favorite essays. There's a kind of multiple temporal dimension that's enacted in the kind of layering of prefaces that is also, I think, incredibly pedagogically useful. So Cherie Moraga has a preface in 1981, Moraga and Anzaldúa in 1981, Moraga in 2001 writes a preface resituating Bridge in the context of September 11th and the War on Terror. Brittany Cooper has a preface to the 2015 edition of Some of Us Are Brave. And so these forwards and prefaces do more than just update or resituate these anthologies. I think more importantly, they really communicate a sense of renewal and reconnection. It's a kind of recursive temporality. There's a dialectical relationship between how these essays are situated collectively in the 70s and 80s, and yet how individual pieces become timeless statements and documents about power, about race and gender, about feminist organizing and thinking. Students really also loved seeing some of the crossover between the two anthologies. So Barbara Smith is all over both of them, very prominently pivotal to both anthologies coming together. There's also some really beautiful writing between the contributors and the editors of these volumes. There's a really deep friendship between Barbara Smith and Cherie Moraga. And I have to quote a passage from the 1981 preface of this bridge by Moraga. because I just felt so much love and gratitude while I was reading this. And so this is what Moraga writes, quote, arriving in Roxbury, arriving at Barbara's. By the end of the evening, our first visit together, Barbara comes into the front room where she has made a bed for me. She kisses me, then grabbing my shoulder, she says very solid like, we are sisters. I put myself into bed and roll around with this word sisters for 2 hours before sleep takes over. I earned this with Barbara. It is not a given between us Chicana and Blacks to come to see each other as sisters. This is not a given. I keep wanting to repeat over and over and over again the pain and shock of difference. The joy of commonality is the exhilaration of meeting through incredible odds against it. End quote. So these books mattered then because of how they brought communities to fruition in print, which allowed these communities and dialogues to circulate and connect to others. They matter now not only as historical record and as feminist and queer genealogies, but also because so many of the issues discussed in these anthologies persist today. So for students, my sense is that these anthologies enact a kind of double movement, demonstrating that social change can happen while also marking the recalcitrant and durational violence of the structures of settler colonialism, white supremacy, and the afterlives of slavery. Most importantly, they understand anthologies as vehicles of social change and as of social movement building. And of course, as Jen was saying, of creating institutional space. So teaching these anthologies in full also allowed us to think about the material conditions of production of these anthologies. So it's amazing to see, for example, how many times Bridge went out of print. It was first published by Persephone Press, which was a white women's press that closed in 1983. So Bridge went out of print then. Second edition was published by Kitchen Table Press, which was an entirely women of color press. And in 1995, that press also closed, so Bridge went out of print again. The third edition was published by Third Woman Press in 2000. This is a press that my dissertation chair at the University of California, Berkeley, Chicana feminist Norma Alarcón founded in the late 80s. And this press is still open, but at a very scaled back capacity. So there's a lot to think about in terms of the role of independent feminist presses at that time. These presses no longer exist except for the feminist press at CUNY and also Aunt Lute Press, which is in San Francisco. I remember when Kitchen Table Press closed and how devastating that was because these spaces were so hard won. And so when we're talking also about institutions, we're talking about academia, but I think we can also talk about publishing, about the institutional spaces of publishing and how difficult it remains for certain kinds of work to be recognized and published. There's definitely a Bay Area concentration of these presses, as well as the writers, especially in Bridge. Bridge in particular was not bred of a kind of privileged institutional or academic site. They were very much so grassroots activist projects. They didn't have in some ways didn't desire access to institutional backing. A lot of pre-internet labor went into pulling these incredible projects together. And so the prefaces give us a real sense of how much work was involved, how much communication, how much organizational stuff that happened over the phone, through letter writing, in-person meetings, conferences, without many things that we take for granted today in terms of publication. So it was important for students to see this and for me to be reminded, honestly, of how much community work went into these earlier anthologies, especially because they didn't have the technology that we have now today, but also because these were tight-knit communities doing really intense political movement work. One of the things that really struck me in rereading these books is just the centrality of both lesbianism and class in both anthologies. One student commented that the book should be retitled, but some of us are brave lesbians, because the questions around homophobia and in communities of color and racism in mainstream or white LGBTQ communities were just front and central to both anthologies. In terms of class, one of my favorite passages is from Speaking in Tongues, a letter to third world women writers by Gloria Anzaldúa, who writes, quote, "Forget the room of one's own, write in the kitchen, lock yourself up in the bathroom, write on the bus or the welfare line or on the job or during meals, between sleeping or waking, write while sitting on the john, no long stretches at the typewriter unless you're wealthy or have a patron. You might not even own a typewriter. While you wash the floor or close listen to the words chanting in your body, when you're depressed, angry, hurt, when compassion and love possess you, when you cannot help it," end quote. The last thing I want to mention about what I worked through with the students last semester in terms of reading and teaching these works was the framing of third world women, third world feminisms, and U.S. third world feminism. So I'm reminded, of course, of Chandra Mohanty's collection with Anne Rousseau and Lourdes Torres called Third World Women, and the Politics of Feminism, and also, of course, Mohanty's Under Western Eyes. So you see this term, third world women, in both anthologies. In Bridge, it's deployed as a relation to, or even a modification of, the coalitional term women of color, insofar as it stressed solidarity with borderland, decolonial, and leftist social movements, in what was then commonly referred to as the third world. And this kind of configuration was meant to honor that women were not always organizing as feminists in these locations, but often as part of anti-colonial and leftist resistance movements. So there's a kind of stretching of this rubric of women of color that centered subjectivities formed through forced displacement and migration, Japanese internment, colonialism and neocolonialism, the aftermath of the Vietnam War, the violence of US empire and US settler colonialism. So given the attention to global connections, I do read this figuration of US third world women, and also the claiming of this positionality of third world women as potentially a kind of proto-transnationalist feminist framing. And in fact, these were framings that were intersectional and transnational rubrics simultaneously. As Jennifer points out in Black Feminism Reimagined, these two trajectories of intellectual thought are institutionalized as opposing each other, when in actuality, there's an insistent questioning of the United States as a privileged location, especially throughout Bridge. In Some of Us Are Brave, the term surfaces more obliquely in relation to Black women, as in Black/third world women. And at times, Black women are constituted as part of this category. So Gloria Hull and Barbara Smith write in the preface to Some of Us Are Brave, quote, "Originally, we had thought to make this book not Black women's studies, but third world women's studies. It became apparent almost immediately that we were not equipped to do so. We hope that this one volume on Black women helps to create a climate where succeeding works on American Indian, Asian American, and Latino women can more swiftly come into being," end quote. So I really thought this was a kind of interesting and very quick and brief look into some like a kind of backdoor conversations, or just some discussions about the relationship between Black women's studies and third world women's studies that doesn't really get fully elaborated later on. And I'm really curious about these conversations. There's a both and quality then to these namings. In Bridge, there's also a letter to Barbara Smith by Martha Quintanales titled "I Paid Very Hard for My Immigrant Ignorance," which has a long rumination on the distinctions and overlaps between the framings third world women, women of color, and Black women. So I think these debates reflect important shifts during the civil rights era and the advent of neoliberalism, from a rearticulation of decolonial social movements to a multicultural neoliberalism inherent in the codification of women of color as a category, to current day uses of BIPOC, of which there are several iterations, that foreground anti-Blackness and anti-indigeneity as foundational structures of the US nation state and of racial formation in the US. So students then wanted to know what happened to third world women as a unifying formation. And I had to admit, I didn't quite know. In the first preface to Bridge, Moraga and Ansel Dua write that, quote, the idea of third world feminism has proved to be much easier between the covers of a book than between real live women, end quote. In a piece called The Theoretical Subjects of This Bridge Called My Back, which was published in Haciendo Caras, Making Soul, Making Face, Norma Alarcon cautions against an oppositional critique of Anglo-American feminist subjects of consciousness by asking, do we want to make a subject of the whole world? Writing against Anglo-American, and this was the term at the time, Anglo-American feminists like Alison Jagger and Hester Eisenstein, who effectively reduced the polyvocal theorizing in Bridge to merely descriptions of difference. Alarcon cautions feminists of color about a capitulation to the notion of feminist consciousness. And then there's Chela Sandoval's magnificent methodology, The Oppressed, which I think most succinctly lays the difference, or lays out the difference between what she calls a kind of oppositional consciousness and the differential consciousness that animated US third world feminism. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Jasbir and Jen, thank you so much. I literally can just sit and listen to you all day. You're both so amazing, your insights. I wanted to give you a chance. I have about 17 million new questions that have come up for me listening to you in addition to the ones that I prepared. But I thought that maybe we should just start by allowing each of you to respond briefly to each other's comments.
Yeah, I can go first. First, Jasbir, thank you. That was so generative and incredible to listen to and to think with. I was writing down key terms from your talk that I wanted to sort of, I guess, amplify so that we can continue to talk about them in our conversation. I was really struck by the fact that you started by narrating your encounter with these texts. And it was funny because in an earlier version, an earlier draft of this, I started by narrating my own encounter with this Bridge Called My Back, which was out of print when I was in college and having to like go to various used bookstores in Cambridge. And then finally finding one. And I became really interested in like, this is actually one of the ways that I teach these texts is through telling these stories, right? Mm-hmm. And so I was curious about this idea of how we care for the past as folks working in the field now, mm-hmm. at least part by narrating our history and our intimacies with these texts. Because I think that's actually part of how I teach these texts that's different than how I teach a text like McKinnon's Toward a Feminist Theory of the State, right? I tend not to narrate my intimate relationship with it. And so I'm curious about this idea of care for the past and how we narrate our engagements with these texts. I want to talk more about anthologies. I also appreciated the ways in which you listed a set of anthologies starting in the 80s and kind of running through the 90s. And I'm interested in the space making that happened in these anthologies, which I talked about through the lens of the department, and which I think you really helpfully talked about through the lens of publishing, what it meant to have spaces that would publish these anthologies. And I was really interested in something you said, which resonated with me, which is that students hadn't heard of these anthologies, even if they had read some of the most prominent pieces, which gets back to this sort of bigger question about how we teach these texts as anthologies, right? Like I'm really interested in how some pieces have come to circulate and to have lives apart from the polyvocal text that they were a part of and what that's about. Because just as you said, almost all of my students have read Combahee, Master's Tools, Open Letter to Mary Daly, but when they read them in the context of the anthologies, they encounter them differently, right? They feel them differently. And so I'm really curious about that. You mentioned the term polyvocality, which I think is particularly useful, especially for thinking about Bridge. But I would add to it the question of genre. I often feel when I teach, especially Bridge, my students are asking like, what is this book? How do I think about it? How do I classify it? How do I understand what it is? And you articulated as thinking about who is in struggle together as part of what the assembly of the anthology is. And I often talk about these texts as kind of living documents, both of struggle and of friendship. And so I was really glad that you brought up the idea of friendship and collaboration as a practice of thinking together, of laboring together. I think I have two more things. So I really appreciated your comments about, in particular, lesbianism. I often teach my Black feminist studies class as a rumination on the Black feminist tradition as a lesbian feminist tradition. And I'm following Emily Owens' lead, really curious about the ways in which we narrate histories of US feminism as though lesbian feminism and Black feminism are separate genealogies of thought. And so I'm curious about what it might mean for us to center these two texts in a narrative, and others, I should say. Like, I was also, as you were talking, I was thinking of Frances Beale's Double Jeopardy, right, which thinks is a kind of Marxist analysis. I was thinking about what it means to read Combahee as a Black lesbian feminist text, where I think the lesbian often follows one of Combahee's commitments. And then the last thing I wanted to say is I think there's something so fascinating about both of these texts, and perhaps our own narration of them. I was really struck by the desire for a history, right? Which is what I take Some of Us Are Brave to be about. So I didn't talk about this in my remarks, but Some of Us Are Brave starts with this poem by Alice Walker called Women. And so she says, there were women then, my mama's generation, husky of voice, stout of step, with fists as well as hands, how they battered down doors and ironed starched white shirts, how they led armies, had dragged generals across minefields, booby-trapped kitchens to discover books, desks, a place for us, how they knew what we must know without knowing a page of it themselves. Of course, it sounds very much like in the vein of Alice Walker. It reminds me of the title essay of In Search of Our Mother's Gardens. But I've always been so interested in the desire for a history and the sense of having to write one's own history, which I see in Some of Us Are Brave as writing that history in the space of the university. I think it unfolds in the context of Bridge a bit differently, but I'm really interested in having us talk more about that desire. So those are some of my thoughts. Thank you, Jasbir. Thank you, David.
Thank you, Jen. I haven't had a moment to really digest what you've said, so really appreciate all your comments, and I'm going to move a lot more slowly or a lot less comprehensively through notes that I took from your wonderful presentation. I think the question of anthologies as this key vehicle of producing kind of legible women of color subjectivities and also politics and coalitional struggles is really key here. And the you know, when I had put together the Kessler lecture, actually in 2019, I went through all of the queer anthologies that started emerging, all of the LGBTQ anthologies that started emerging in the 90s, and there were so many of them, including David's and Alice Holm's Q&A, Queer in Asian America, right? So it's interesting to me to think about the anthology as a kind of, I don't know, feminized form, or a form that's been kind of diminished in relation to academic publishing currently. And of course, there's a difference between anthologies and edited collections, I guess. You know, on some level, there's a difference, but the refrain from the academic publishers is that, you know, edited collections are not worth it monetarily, and that people are using journals to kind of find individual pieces. So I hadn't really thought this through until I committed to kind of teaching both the anthologies in full, how much we lose from that mindset, I think, or how much the anthology as this vehicle has been displaced by, you know, kind of access to technology that allows us to kind of separate out these really collective conditions of production, right, of social production that's happening. And so that's the other thing too, that the anthology really registers social production in a way that individual articles do not register, and in a way that, you know, books register those modes of and the labors of social reproduction, but only as the kind of self-narration in the acknowledgements, right? Not so much as kind of things that you can start reading through the anthology. Like, this is what happened in order for this to become a thing, and this is how we had to reproduce ourselves. You know, that passage from Gloria Anzaldúa, where Anzaldúa is talking about when she writes, right? When she writes, if she's on the welfare line or when she's on the toilet or whatever, like that, those kind of acts of social reproduction become really, really prominent. And I think that, you know, really, really important. And this thing about, you know, reproducing the star system is something that I think we all struggle with in these kinds of critical interdiscipline formations, that are driven, that are fields that have been driven by social movement organizing histories, right? So queer studies, gender studies, even some versions of American studies, Asian American studies. I mean, all of these studies fields, have, I think, a very kind of critical, ambivalent relationship to reproducing the kind of canonical essay, for example, right? Specifically in gender studies, I'm in a department where we attempt not to produce reading lists for our graduate students, right? Because we don't want to standardize what it is they're supposed to know. And at the same time, we're still obviously creating canonical forms of literature and, on our syllabi. So this is a kind of tension, I think, that's ongoing for me always. And then why is it that some essays become singularly mobile along with their place in the anthology as well, right? So what is it about these essays that become resonant for students and for us also as necessary to teach, regardless of the star system, or how do they become, part of this? You said, do we teach the people who have since then become famous, right? For the students, these people are, they understand them in kind of retroactively as the kind of star scholars of Black feminism, of women of color feminism. The second or the kind of main chunk of your comments was just a really incredibly intense and necessary reminder of our complicated relationships to institutions and institutionalization, right? And this is something that gender studies has had an issue with from the get-go, right? It's not just Black women's studies, but it's also Robin Wiegman's work, right, on the institutionalization of gender studies that, she put together. That volume was like 15 years ago. And, on some level, it is, my students responded to this very, very interestingly. After reading Some of Us Are Brave, some of them were like, well, Black women's studies should be women's studies. Why is it not women's studies, And I think it's really interesting, that's like, and of course, that's definitely, why isn't it? That's a good question. I think it's also at the same time really interesting that Smith and Hull, and I don't know how deep this struggle was because they don't really elaborate that much, but in that passage that I read, they struggled with a kind of the initial aspiration, or one initial aspiration was actually to have a volume on third world women's studies, right? Which I don't even know what that would have then wrought. That would have been a kind of like if that had happened alongside, or if that had happened instead, or can we read Bridge as that collection of third world women's studies as well? But I guess more broadly, we're in such a moment or time, the institution that Black feminists demanded access to, and were creating space within and showing their kind of power and their capacities through But Some of Us Are Brave. That university doesn't exist anymore, and so it's like, so I guess there's just a question for me about, yes, ambivalence, yes, we're in the university, of the university, all of these things. Yes, we have we have Moten, we have Fred Moten and Stefano on Undercommons, and all of these ways of thinking about fugitivity and all the rest of it. But we also have a very different academia, I think, than we had 40 years ago, or even 20 years ago, 25 years ago. I think academia is just such a different. I don't even think of myself as working at a university anymore. I don't work at a corporate university. I work at a corporation. There's no way around that kind of recognition. The institutional spaces that Smith and Hull were arguing for were not the spaces of today. And so I just wanted to think more about, in the context of what do we do about institutionalization in the context of extreme grad student exploitation and grad student strikes going on, a kind of continuing precarity for scholars of color, all of the precarity that's, the university is a precarious workplace for a majority of its workers, actually, at this point. We see that over and over again. At Rutgers University, has a very, very strong union that's kind of constantly pointing out how precarious most of the laborers are, if we are all thinking of ourselves as workers. So yeah, I really loved everything that you had to say. It really made me think a lot. So thank you.
So I wanted to say to the audience that if you do have questions, please start putting them into the comments. But I feel like we have so much incredible material to discuss. And I do think that there actually is a lot more to say about the nature of the anthology that both of you are talking about. To me, when I think about my own encounters with these two texts, they really laid the foundation for queer studies, and particularly white queer studies. And I do think that trying to historicize that, what you are saying, Jasbir, is the feminized mode of the anthology, is key to feminist gender and queer studies. I think that for me, anthologies are always contingent communities. And what comes out so clear in both of them is that those communities are driven out of love, and love for each other. And you said my edition of Bridge is the second edition, and just the opening lines of Shuri Moraga's foreword, she says, 3 years later, I try to imagine the newcomer to Bridge. What do you need to know? I've heard from people that the book has helped change some minds and hopefully hearts as well, but it has changed no one more than the women who contributed to its existence. And so I was thinking a lot about what you were saying in terms of the duration, not just the history, but the duration of anthology over time, which is that it's done primarily as space clearing. It creates a publishing space, it creates an institutional space for a community that has no space. And so I've always thought about, you do an anthology only under those conditions, when you need to create that space that isn't there. And that is done again and again, not just primarily for the people who do it, but for future generations, because as you just said, Jasbir, the institution of the university has shifted so radically over our lifetimes. And I think that's a whole other area really of discussion in terms of, let's say, corporatization, the internet, the atomization of technology, and what that does to the possibilities of creating these collective communities. And one of my really life mantras and sayings that I repeat again and again to students is something from Angela Davis, which is that you let your politics drive your identity. You don't let your identity drive your politics. And to me, that is really a key understanding to what is the ambivalence, I think, Jen, that you bring up again and again about the institution. And on the one hand, the ways in which women of color, Black studies has been institutionalized, and that's a necessary institutionalization. But at the same time, and that's one that's driven by politics, versus another form of institutionalization that's driven by identity. So, that's my initial thoughts in terms of that question of anthologies. But I also do think that because the internet is this pharmacon and it's allowed people to access individual articles at the expense of understanding that collective, how do we think about the collective in relation to this changing history that you both just put on the table? That was a conversation stopper. I didn't mean it to be that way.
That was the sound of us thinking. This is answers to none of your questions. It's just perhaps to throw more things out there about sort of building on what you were asking, David, about anthologies. The passage that you read from Chedi Moraga, one of the things that I think is so interesting about my own experience as a reader of Bridge is that I always feel like I'm eavesdropping on a conversation that started. I love that feeling, right? I love the feeling that there's a conversation that started that I'm joining, right? It's like a feeling of coming to a party that's already started, right? And so I think there's something there about, as you said, like the duration of anthology, and particularly in Bridge, the sense that it's a living text that's revised and revisited and remade in response to the varying and changing conditions of the present. I thought, Jasbir, you had a moment, I didn't capture exactly how you said it, but thinking about if there's a difference between the anthology and the edited collection. Mm-hmm. And I was thinking about that question alongside your comments about how the university is different, right? Because one of the things that always strikes me is that the trouble the anthology produces for those of us who are parts of it in the culture of counting in the current university. So I think there is a celebration of scattered hegemonies. We should drop a footnote and say there's something really interesting about the culture of celebration in feminism right now. So like the celebration of these anniversaries, the celebration of various feminist scholarly journals. So there's something really interesting about a desire to commemorate. But anyway, Graywell and Kaplan were talking about scattered hegemonies and how it posed certain problems for them when they went through the tenure process. And in each of their institutions, they were asked, what % of the work did you do? And they insisted, well, we each did 100% of the work. And so there's something really fascinating about the problem. Like I was always advised, like, don't publish in anthologies, don't co-edit an anthology, it doesn't count, right? So this idea of counting and how that changes when the edited anthology moves from kitchen table press to, I was thinking of an anthology like Black Queer Studies, also a field-defining anthology on Duke University Press. So we might want to think about that shift alongside some of the shifts in the university that you were mapping, Jasbir, earlier.
Yeah, I love this. I love this thing about the trouble that anthologies generate, and which also reminds me again that they're space clearing projects. They're also activist projects. There are forms of activism as well, which is so important, and also why they get shut down by the university, or why you have to insist on having done 100% of the work and collaborative, endeavors. And also, I think because of the kind of genre, multiplicity of genre that's going on in these anthologies too, right? That they don't, they're both, to go back to a lot of Jen, the way, you situate this, they're both, readily commodified, at the same time not registered as a contribution, right? So that's the tension that we deal with with so many forms. What I was thinking about too, David, when you said space clearing, it's also there's a commitment to language. There's a commitment to thinking about language in both of the anthologies, right? So it's not just a space, it's a space clearing, yes, but it's a space clearing through a demand for one's own language and one's capacity to develop language, or to be creative with language, or to create language. And there's, the pieces, like Jen, when you're talking about like eavesdropping on a party, the pieces are so incredibly intimate. They're so incredibly, like some of my students were like, can we talk like that now? And I'm like, I don't know, I don't think we can actually. I don't think we can say that lesbian separatism is racist, and I have that totally fly, like they were like, wow, this is so interesting that everyone's so candid. Everyone is so incredibly intensely rigorous, and there's so much self-interrogation going on at the same time, right? Like, how do we build coalitions across difference is something that comes up over and over and over again in this Bridge in particular. There's Cheryl Clark's essay on loving white women, so there's so much attention to the intensity and the intimacy of building relationships across intense differences, right? Which I really love. So I think these are all, for me, elements of the trouble that anthologies bring. they demand not just space, but different language, different genre, different intimacies, different claim to relationality. You know, it's all of it, I think, that winds up becoming threatening, right? And also then not seen as scholarly, not seen as, credit worthy, that kind of thing. So those are some of the things I was thinking about when both you and David were talking.
Jasbir, can you and Jen then talk a little bit about this issue of intimacy? Because they are so intimate. It's as if you're entering this relationship, right, between two women or groups of women. And that intimacy actually does not give over to the kind of moral certitude that, Jennifer, you indexed in your talk. And when you say that the undergraduates ask you, oh, are we allowed to talk like this? Can we say these things? I think that's because of the way in which there has been a moral certitude that has overlaid national, local, and community politics, especially in the wake of our last administration. And so I'm really fascinated about the way in which rethinking all of the aspects of anthologies actually allow us a kind of critique of the moral certitude of politics, of identity politics today.
Yeah, one thing, just quickly, one thing my students, one thing one of my students said was something like lesbian separatism is our version of or is a version of cancel culture. so they really had issues with lesbian separatism because to them it really represented the kind of anxieties and feelings of being cut off and feelings of not being able to have a lot of expressive space around kind of self-interrogation and asking questions, making mistakes that cancel culture represents for them today. So this moral certitude hangs over their own relationship to these anthologies as well, right? They're not sure that they're allowed to, do they have permission to engage with these texts the way the texts are kind of opening up, offering permission to do so.
And this sort of moves in a different direction, but I mean, one of the things that strikes me, David, to your point about intimacy, and I'm thinking again, especially with, is just how varied, the way that I would phrase it now is how varied the archives are that different writers and thinkers are drawing on, right? So dreams are evidence. There's theory in the flesh. There's folks writing about anger and rage, memories of their mothers. Memory becomes a really rich archive. I think so much about how the idea of dream surfaces in Bridge. So in one of the prefaces, I can't remember which one, I have dreamed of a bridge that leads into Donna Kate Russian's The Bridge poem. So I think there's something really interesting about what's being drawn on as what I might call evidence, right? That produces an immediate intimacy between reader and text. Mm-hmm. And then I think, and this goes back to some of the earlier comments about anthology, and I think this is, to me, feels particular to Bridge. What strikes me as so remarkable about it is that there's no desire to erase points of tension or struggle that exist within the text, right? That all of the seams are visible, including to where you started as Jasbir with all of the prefaces, right? That they all coexist, and the sense that any future versions will have all of the previous prefaces. So we see the seams, the construction of the book itself, and it's a document that is about friendship and intimacy, but also about struggle, and the fact that texts will literally be side by side within the cover of the book that think in very different ways about race, about nation, about color, about desire, about mothers and daughters. So I think that's part of what makes it feel distinct, that makes it feel intimate, the refusal to offer a singular, this goes back to the idea of the polyvocal, a singular voice or vision.
I think
and I think,
oh, sorry, go ahead, Jasbir.
Just really to basically reiterate that too, but again, there's so much intensely rigorous self-interrogation going on And so the part of that intimacy is we make mistakes, or we don't know how to do this, or I'm with a white woman and I'm not sure what it means, or I mean, all of that stuff that I think, feels it's kind of disavowed by institutional spaces as legitimate evidence, but winds up being so, quite simply so inspiring to the students, right? These texts are radical. They remind us that there's no linear progress. They remind us that political institutional struggles are worth it. And they remind us that that interpersonal relations are everything, right? And that's where those struggles start, and that's where they end. So I think that's part, again, I love this phrase, the trouble that anthologies generate, right? That's part of it again, that there's maybe not such an articulated, maybe more sublimated need on the part of the university to not have these kinds of work proliferate, in a sense, right? Because it really does undermine the kind of both what scholarship looks like, what kind of like rational politics looks like, what language looks like, what discourse and public speech looks like. All of these things are being rearranged. They are of that time in the 80s and the 70s, but they are rearranged for the students because the students don't understand, like they don't have access to that in the ways that we might have had access to this 25 years ago, or for myself, 30 years ago. Didn't seem so odd. I was reading all of these anthologies. It was incredible. But revisiting them with my students made me realize how shrunken down their spaces are around these questions of political consciousness and, growing, learning, all these things.
I think in that sense, you can think of them also as pedagogical exercises, not just for the public, but for the private. And I do think that they really show you a process of working through difference as opposed to disavowing difference. And I think that the disavowal of difference is actually what puts you into a framework of moral certitude. And it's actually the working through that allows you not to actually become intimate with otherness. And that is as true within, let's say, Black feminist studies as it is between and among various women of color. But, I guess there are two questions that for me emerge from that. One really is how I was so struck looking at the anthologies again, going back to Jen's point about institutionalization, that I would say probably half the contributors to Brave have some sort of institutional affiliation, whereas that's not true for Bridge. And so it raises really interesting questions around coalition, around, as you said, Jen, Blackness standing in for all difference versus the possibility of coalition. So that's one whole area I think that really needs to be opened up in relation to putting the two anthologies in discussion with one another. But going back to the issue of moral certitude, it's always been so fascinating to me about the kind of moral certitude that cancel culture enacts on language, on intimacy, on otherness. And, how do we think then what has been the evolution of gay and lesbian to queer to trans and something like non-binary gender, right? How do we think that, which is not in terms of polarization, in terms of certitude, but in terms of a third space or in terms of a kind of deconstructive notion of self and other, whether it's gender or whether it's race, how do we put those two things together? So, those are very two different areas, but they were both questions that I had thought a lot about coming in to the conversation. But now listening to you, I feel like that, these are a whole two other areas of development that I would love to hear your thoughts about in terms of the way that we just talked, so I think seriously about the nature of anthologies.
Sorry, David, the second question I got, which is about non-binary gender, right? What was the first question?
The first question really was about the possibility of coalition between and among, because I do think that you see a very different development in the two anthologies. And so insofar as one is women of color across categories and the other is exclusively on Black feminist studies. and that there's also an uneven development, because what you see in Brave is that perhaps half the contributors have institutional positions and almost none do in Bridge. And so I was thinking about that in relation to what Jen said earlier, which is the way in which Blackness comes to stand in for all difference, but that also it can become the space through which the question of difference is interrogated. So really, you know, that question of whether we're going to take the category of Black women as an icon, or whether we're going to take the category of Black women as a portal or a question through which difference is interrogated.
Do you want me to go first, Jasbir?
Sure. I was just spacing out actually for a moment.
So, you know, some of the things that I was thinking as you were talking, David, is so since teaching has been so much a part of our conversation, I'm developing this class for next year on the public life of Black feminism. And we're only reading trade books, starting with Joan Morgan's When Chicken Heads Come Home to Roost through the present. And so we're reading books almost entirely written by folks who are not in the university. And the conceit of the class is that, and this has become especially true teaching in the last 10 years, that most of my students encounter Black feminist thought, not through anthologies like this, but on Instagram, Twitter, social media, through reading trade books, and even, and this has been so fascinating to me, like through gender studies classes in high school, which is a whole separate conversation, but like seeing students come into the college setting and say, I already know what intersectionality is because I read about Crenshaw and AP US history. And it's like, okay, that's fascinating. So there is something really interesting to me about this, how we've moved from a moment where the project of kind of forging space for Black women's intellectual thought was about carving space in the university, to the moment that we're in right now, where I think there's a live debate within and among Black feminists about where the space clearing needs to happen, right? So I think of someone like Brittany Cooper, who I think at once has a deep attachment to the idea of intellectual history as a category that she wants to recuperate and think through Black women's writing and Black women's thinking through this category that I have no attachments to or investments in. And at the same time, right, she's one of the most public facing Black feminist thinkers and voices with books like Eloquent Rage. And so I'm curious about how we ended up in a moment where I sometimes think if we assembled something like, but some of us are brave in this moment, we would have many more folks who are working outside of the university. Simply Black feminist thought sort of circulates in more spaces, in more sites, with different kinds of publics. I'm not saying that Black feminism didn't speak to publics. I think it's always a tradition that's spoken to publics, but I think there's new demands for and markets for Black feminist work that speaks to publics. And so maybe one of the things that we need to think through more is the question of markets, right? Which I think sort of animates the demand for both of these texts. So that's sort of some thoughts on the first part of your first question. And the second part of that question is, I think the category, I mean, Jasbir gestured to this, is something I write about in my second book. I think what Black woman has meant to women's studies that's its own long, complicated history, right? And different than what women of color has meant to women's studies. And I think there's much more to say about the kinds of bodies that women's studies has desired women of color to be, and thinking through different moments in what that category has meant for women's studies. So I think of, again, narrating my own history as a women's studies student in the late 1990s, first encountering something that we might now call transnational feminism that was narrated to me through African women. Right. And like that, and there was very much a live debate about so-called female genital mutilation. And we read Alice Walker and sort of watched Warrior Marks. And that was kind of how we thought about a feminism that quote unquote crossed borders. Right. And then I think about the moment that I wrote my second book in, where I was thinking a lot about hiring and the categories that we use in hiring in the academic feminist marketplace, where women of color meant South Asian women, right? And like transnational feminism meant South Asian women. They're all, I'm thinking here with Jennifer Suchland, for example, who writes about what happens to quote unquote second world women and like racial categorizations that women's studies has established. But I think there are really complicated histories and genealogies of Black women and women of color for academic feminism and produced by academic feminism. And I think there's a really interesting intersection between these two genealogies and those categories. So I think there was a time, I think there still is a time when the expectation was that the voice in which Latinx feminism would be circulated within academic feminism would be the voice that we see in this bridge, right? Would be precisely the kind of intimate voice that you were describing, David. Would be a voice that was interested in bridge crossing and borders. That these were like the primary analytics that would animate Latinx feminisms. And so I think scholarly work that didn't fit within that paradigm somehow became invisible within the frame of academic feminism. So those are some thoughts / rambles on the first question. Jasbir, I don't know if you wanted to jump in.
No, I mean, you know, your analysis of institutional histories is unparalleled as far as I'm concerned, you know, and I still have this question about what happened to third world women feminism. What happened to it? You know, the last time you kind of hear about it is like, I don't know, mid-90s. There's Shayla Sandoval's brilliant book, and then it's like mid-90s. Chandra Mohanty publishes another article or two on it, and then it just kind of disappears. And it's like, it was kind of a question almost for you, Jennifer, because you've done so much tracing of these genealogical histories. But I don't want to. I'm not expecting you to know this, but you know, transnational feminism, some versions of it, I think, overstated the US-ness of women of color feminisms in a lot of ways, right? Because you see, and also again, you know, the issue of Blackness standing in for all difference, there's this very intense moment of ambivalence that Barbara Smith and Gloria Hull articulate in the preface, which is like, well, we wanted to do this other book, and this is what we wound up doing. And I would love, I don't know if there's more information about that or archives to find or where those letters are, you know, but I would love to know more about what that conversation was like, because clearly that stance, you know, there's an ambivalence, a very productive ambivalence there that could tell us more about that time period and that kind of relationship between third world feminisms, Black feminism, women of color feminism, transnational feminism, like all of that stuff that is, you know, as you show in your work, becomes institutionally bifurcated, but actually, like in praxis, is completely imbricated, right? They're not easy lines to draw around any of this stuff.
Right. I just would shout out, like Shirin Rosh-Alvin has done some interesting work on the category of third world women, trying to think this question of like what happened to it. And Durba Mitra, who gave a lecture at Duke's workshop a couple of weeks ago, is thinking with that question, and I think trying to recuperate or recover third world women as not just as a moment that passed, but as having some kind of promise and utility for us in the present, which I find really encouraging.
I'm cognizant of time. I wanted to give both of you a chance to offer some closing remarks. I'm curious about what you're both reading and that you would recommend to our audiences. But most of all, I just wanted to express my gratitude for this really dazzling and stimulating conversation.
Thank you, David.
Thank you, David.
I guess I want to start by saying again, like, it's just such a pleasure to be in conversation with Jasbir. For many, many years, we've talked to each other on the page and have not had as much of an opportunity to talk to each other in real time. So it's really a pleasure.
We should do this every Friday. You guys are so amazing.
It's just wonderful to be in space with you. Reading now. I mean, most of my reading now is for my class, but I will say I just read Marquise Bay's new book, Black Trans Feminism, which is on University Press, and it's fantastic. And I'm teaching to this topic of the university. I'm teaching Matt Brim's Port Queer Studies next week. And it's a text that I have found really quite useful. Going back, Jasbir, to your comment about the question of what happened to class in Black women's studies, and I really appreciate how Brim sort of centers that question in his call for a Port Queer Studies.
Yeah, I'm teaching a class called Decarcerating Disability at the University of Chicago. So, we just finished Liat Ben Mosh's Decarcerating Disability. The class is really focused on thinking about abolition and disability justice together. So insofar as both of those rubrics are, really big interests for our students in gender studies. It's, I've got a lot of gender studies students in that class. Next week, we're reading On Property by Ronaldo Walcott, because we're really grounding the analysis of disability in capitalism and a kind of approaches to abolishing property that Ronaldo takes up in that. So that's what I'm in the middle of reading right now.
Thanks so much. I think Melissa is going to come on with some closing words.
Yes. So I'll just say this was, as David said, the most dazzling and thought-provoking conversation I've listened to in ages. I thank you, Jen and Jasbir and David, for all of your comments and questions and those two incredibly thoughtful meditations. You've just given me so much to chew on. I've been frantically taking notes. So I'm going to follow up on David's suggestion that we all do this every Friday because this is exactly, seriously, what I need to round out the weeks. But for now, I'll say thank you to all of you. Thank you to Maria for all of your incredible work organizing this. And I look forward to forward conversations.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.